as Kamila said in the introduction, my father was from Pakistan, and my mother is English. And the genesis of the novel really could be located in a trip that I took to Pakistan with my father when I was 19 or 20, just after I left school. And a couple of things happened on that trip that sunk into my consciousness. And one of them was a trip to his village and meeting his cousins, and for the first time in my life getting a sense of the world he'd come from and the sort of background he'd been born into, which I had had no idea about growing up in England, because my family was not very much, were not particularly connected to his roots and his background. So that was a completely new experience for me. And I didn't really do anything with the experience in that moment. It was something like 20 years later, when I'd been writing screenplays, and it was after 9/11, and I'd been commissioned by the BBC to write something with the Indian filmmaker Udayan Prasad about a Bangladeshi girl who's harassed in the wake of 9/11, and that project fell through, and I had a very strong desire that came from that experience with my father in Pakistan to write a short story about that was inspired really by a couple of images that stayed with me from that visit. And I suppose the desire to turn it into fiction, I think it gives you a lot of freedom to, and to take an image as I did in that story and to run with it in a way that frees you up. If you are simply writing journalism or non-fiction, you have to stick with facts in a way that I think is constraining as a writer. So there was one event that happened, which was my father's cousin, who we'd been visiting in the village, had wanted him to take a bottle of holy water to a relative in England, and my father had forgotten to bring it. So he was staying with some wealthy friends in Lahore, and the cousin made a long journey to convey the bottle to my father. And in that moment, I was able to witness that sort of pull that he had between the wealthy urban world of Lahore and the poor village which he'd grown up with. And that stayed with me for a long time, but it didn't become a book till I was much older.
Would you read a little bit of the book?
Yeah. This is the beginning. The house where Harris lived was on a hill. After 4 years in the north of England, he had become adept at hill starts, managing the steep gradients in that part of the world with a deft combination of clutch control and handbrake operation. The neighbourhood was mainly Pakistani, yet this fact did not make Harris feel at home. Home was the home county where he had once lived with his wife and daughter. Now that chunk of his life was over. His real name was Harris, but upon arrival from Pakistan in the 1970s, he had found that people balked at its pronunciation, recoiling from the long, flat vowel sound. So he had obligingly adopted the name Harris instead, after the celebrated tweed, whose label was stitched inside a cap he had bought from the Scotch House on Piccadilly. It was stamped with the British Royal Crest, suggesting that Prince Philip owned one too, and Harris was convinced he had seen that very royal sporting something similar on a Christmas television programme. He was a slight, elegant man of 5'5" or 5'6", depending on his mood when he was filling in official documents. And he was rather keen on smart clothes. Within weeks of his arrival, he had made himself familiar with all the best British labels, taking considerable pride in his newly suited look. Crockett & Jones shoes were purchased, along with Jeeves and Hawkes shirts, and a suit and several ties from Austin Reed. The aquascutum overcoat he wore during that first freezing winter still carried the white label proclaiming the brand on the left cuff. After his divorce, however, people noticed he'd lost his enthusiasm for style. He'd been forced to retrench, and his beloved clothes were the first casualty. To get by, he depended on a stack of credit cards he carried everywhere in an old leather wallet, hoping and believing that one day, eventually, something would turn up. But nothing quite did, not in this neck of the woods. Harris had always felt a tincture of pride and guilt that he had vaulted to success from a Commonwealth country to southeast England, rather than having to hole up in the northern town ghettos like his less fortunate relatives. Now he was stuck in a part of the world he had once counted himself lucky to shun, a former mill town that had seen better days. Several of the terraced houses in the street were condemned, boarded up with punched metal sheets blanking out the sunlight. Rickety loft extensions burst forth from cramped houses that struggled to contain their denizens from spilling onto the streets. The neighborhood was a testament to unfulfilled DIY ambition. Cheap conservatories, rashly purchased, flapped unfinished in the wind. Dilapidated sheds, relics from an older generation of dahlia growers and diggers for victory, were filled with broken suitcases and unidentifiable chunks of self-assembly furniture. His neighbours seemed quite unperturbed by their surroundings. Come rain or shine, the women threw on rubber flip-flops, pulled flimsy emerald and fuchsia departures around them, and pegged out the washing in the forlorn hope that the English north wind might blow it dry before the next downpour. One or two elderly ladies tended brass cooking pots on open fires in their handkerchief-sized front lawns. Braver ones ventured up the hill with old chapatis and burnt toast to feed the pigeons congregating by the swings and roundabouts in the half-finished playground. The news that their wayward relative was returning to the fold had been greeted with unbridled enthusiasm by a coterie of male cousins. In the vanguard was Navaz, a stocky, bearded fellow pushing 40, who waged a forceful campaign of persuasion that had resulted in Harris's purchase of a small terraced house, with a chocolate-brown hallway and no central heating. It had been going for a song, and he could no longer afford to be choosy, as Navaz was fond of reminding him. And so, with a modest down payment borrowed from the bank, he had managed to cobble together a mortgage to buy it, a temporary staging post, he thought, until something better turned up. Thank you, Rosie.
When you wrote this, did you find that in some way writing it made you understand your father better, or had you already come to that point of understanding the man as well as then went on to create a fictional character?
I think it did. I think it did help me understand him better, and I think in the book I tried to show a range of Muslim characters. I sometimes feel that, certainly in Britain, there's a bit of a monolithic portrayal of those figures, and certainly in certain types of films and TV scenarios, fathers are always portrayed. Muslim fathers are always portrayed as bearded and tyrannical, and my father was a blend of different things, and he felt very pulled by the religion and his sense of trying to be a westernized person. So I think it did help me to understand it, but it also but I pushed myself in other directions, as I say, because I needed to fictionalize it in order to create some plot and drama.
Yeah, there's a great deal of understanding, I think, in the way you create the character. You don't shy away from his faults. So, for instance, you have a man who is very disapproving of his daughter having a boyfriend,
Right.
But has no problems with him having, himself having a girlfriend.
Right.
And it's presented sort of very straight up as, and yet you don't come across thinking, oh, this man is just a pure hypocrite. You
Right.
sort of manage to write it in a way that you see the conflicts within the character, which I think is really sensitively done here.
Right, and that's something that definitely has intrigued me, and that I explored in the book is the notion of its hypocrisy, and there's ambivalence about one's role in society and in culture. And in the story, Harris is alone, and he begins to fall in love with a woman, and he keeps the relationship secret from his daughter, whilst at the same time disapproving of his daughter's relationship that he discovers. So there are all sorts of secrets and deceptions between the characters that filter through the story and filter through the familial relations. And I think you're right that it's not. I try not to make it judgmental. It's not about lambasting someone for their hypocrisy. It's more that human foible, certainly within families, of people keeping information back.
Yeah.
And child protection in some way.
Now, it's interesting, you mentioned that you started writing this after a project that was commissioned post 9/11.
Yeah.
And so we had that term 9/11 come up, even though the book has nothing to do with it. But what interested me is I think very often, and in a rather tedious manner, not that I have strong feelings on this, there is an assumption that if a novelist is in any way influenced by the events on 9/11, that influence will be that they will then want to go and write the stereotype because that's what the West wants, which seems a ridiculous way to think about it. But what you seem to suggest is actually there was a different kind of impulse. That because, as you said, there was a particular stereotype of the Muslim male, that what you wanted was to write against it. And you've also done that with the women. I mean, there's a range of sort of women characters. Could you talk just a little, tell the audience about the different Pakistani women, the different kinds of Pakistani women who appear in this book?
Well, for example, the woman that Harris falls for she's a highly educated Pakistani woman who's living in London, and she doesn't believe in God, but she has cultural affinity with Islam, and in the end, in their relationship, those differences she and Harris bump up against in that story, and then Harris has a group of cousins who live in the north of England who are related to his family from the village back in Pakistan, and the women there are more conservative, but I try to show the hybrid of the effect of northern English culture upon those people and the women in particular. So Alia, who is Harris's daughter, witnesses when she goes and spends time up in the north with her father. Nasreen, who's the wife of Harris's cousin, is in some ways she's quite subservient, but at the end she stands up for her husband. So again, she's an interesting fusion and a blend of of Pakistani Muslim and also British influences. So it's a mix. And then the wife of Harris's best friend from college, Kamila, she's called. She's a very powerful figure, and she comes from a powerful, wealthy family in Lahore. And there's a certain harshness to her almost, and you see those clashes between the women and those who come from very different backgrounds and different classes.
But you do also have in there a figure of a radical preacher, and I wondered because one way would be to sort of avoid inside this, because that is the stereotype of the Muslim male, right, in England now, is these young men who get radicalized by men in mosques and then go off and do things. And you lead us towards that story in a certain way. And was there one thinking, do I just want to avoid this kind of Muslim character altogether, or do I want to play with it? What's your thinking?
It's very tricky, isn't it? Because, as writers with South Asian lineage or connection, we're constantly told, well, it's such a cliche to write about a corner shop or arranged marriage or things that connect to extremism, but they are also a huge part of the story and part of the culture. So I felt that there would be something a bit disingenuous in avoiding that story in a way. And also the part of London where I was living, which is Whitechapel in East London, it's quite a tiny bit of London, and there, when you walk around there, you do have a sense of there's a big mosque there, and you do have a sense of people with extremist views leafleting and speaking in the mosque. And it's been a big struggle in Britain, and I think as a writer you sort of have a responsibility to tell that story if it can be worked organically into the main story. And for me, I was interested in Rashid, who is the character who is taken in by the firebrand preacher. He's taken in because of feeling displaced and marginalised, and he's struggling to find an identity in this country, and it happens that he's a Muslim, but it could have also happened in America with the kind of extreme Christianity that you see there, and it's about filling a vacuum. And so I wanted to show that story and tell that story, and it felt that it was right for the book. And in the end, he doesn't follow through. and I think that would have been too predictable in a way, and also the number of cases when extreme thoughts follow through into action are really very limited.
Yes, that's a significant point as well in that story. Yeah. You know, a lot of stories about migrants is about the loss of the place they left behind. But one of the sort of interesting things you do in here is that it seems to be more centrally, and maybe I'm misreading or reading in a different way, but it seems not so much about the loss of things left behind, but the attachment ties that remain, and how you work with them in a new context. So one of the title, The Small Fortune, comes from Harry comes into some money and has to decide what to do with it, and he never really thinks about spending it on himself.
Right.
You know, he's not an affluent man, but the thought that he could spend this money to make himself comfortable does not occur, and it becomes which member of his family should he give it to. And is this something you feel sort of strongly in the book, that it's about how the Pakistani family operates when it then moves to a different country?
Yes, I think that is a really interesting and important theme that kind of comes up in Britain, where the Pakistani community is very well established there. And I'd certainly, in my own, through my friends and relatives in Britain, I had come across a lot of these sorts of situations in which wills and legacies and amounts of money and how they are dispersed amongst relatives is quite a big theme. I think it's a big theme in all families, and it was interesting to me to see the sort of the impact upon those characters.
You in fact wrote an article called "What Do I Owe My Father's Far-Flung Family," which tells the story about an uncle, which is an interesting story. Would you mind retelling that?
Yes, I only discovered that my father had a half-brother in the last year of his life, when he was dying of cancer. And as I said, that growing up in the 70s, it was sort of before multiculturalism had really kind of bedded down in England. So he tended to keep his life in Pakistan and his background a little separate from his British life and his family. So we didn't know about the half-brother who began writing. Well, he'd been writing letters to my father on his deathbed about his will and what he might gain in his will. And after my father died, he did get in touch with me and wrote to me and asked me to send him some religious books and some things like that. And it was strange to me to have that connection to someone that I'd never actually met or had any kind of relationship with. And that's also something that I explore in the book, is the nature of family relationship versus the nature of friendship. And I personally feel that a lot of my friends are as important to me as my family, and that's definitely something that I learned from my father, who has had very, very strong friendships that have stretched across decades and continents. But as far as the half-brother goes, I wrote a piece about receiving this letter and receiving the approach from him, and having a sense of my father's unfulfilled feelings of guilt and responsibility about taking care of his family back home. I know it was something that always troubled him, and it was a bridge that he never really ever managed to cross. So that was the piece.
Yeah. And then did you keep in touch with the uncle? Did you ever hear from him again? Did you send him the books?
I sent him, well, in the end I sent him, he had a slightly tragic story, which he'd lost his wife and he got remarried and he'd lost his wife. So I sent him money, and he'd asked for some jewellery and some other things. I sent him some presents for his children, and then I never heard back from him, and I wondered if I should write, and I did write, and then I never heard from him till 15 years later, when my book came out. And he got in touch with me via a bookstore in Brooklyn in New York, where I'd had a reading. And so then we've been in email contact since then. But I've never actually met him in person, so it's slightly strange for me.
But do you feel that there is such a thing as a familial tie, even with people you've never met, and who your father, obviously didn't have much to do with?
I think maybe I have a different perspective on that. I'm not sure that I do. It feels odd to me to be in touch with someone that I don't have any concrete relationship with. And I think if you start to think about the mathematics of all of your relatives found out across the globe, it's an awful lot of people potentially.
Well, yeah, you don't have to fan them out across the globe. Fan them across the province, and that's enough.
So yes.
Within the book, as I said, it starts post Harris's divorce, and you don't really see him interacting with the English, and even sort of the ex-wife doesn't really come in, even the form of memory very much. Was that a sort of very conscious decision that you wanted to keep it just within these Pakistanis?
I did. I felt that the story I wanted to tell was a midlife story. And when I'd first written the book, a couple of people who read it, an agent who'd read it and a publisher had said, you know, maybe this should be a coming-of-age story about Alia, the 20-year-old girl. And in the end, that story was less interesting to me. I'm interested in someone in the midpoint of their life. So I had to make a choice to leave behind that other story. And maybe it's that question that you started the session with. It's the distancing yourself from fact and fiction, that maybe there was too much real life in there for me, that I needed to put that out of my mind in order to creatively come up with something that was different.
Has it fogged up actual memories? And are there points when you think, wait, did that really happen, or did I write it?
It has, actually, and that's the funny thing about memory. You know, this summer I was having a conversation with my sister about my father, who was very keen on cars, a little bit like Harris in this story. And we both had half a memory each, because we'd grown up in Cyprus in the early part of our lives, and I remembered my father driving onto the sands and the car getting stuck in the sand, which was a very kind of classic thing to happen to him. He was always kind of having problems with his car. And she remembered, and I also had some half image of pink flamingos, and she remembered that he'd driven onto the sand so we'd get a better image of the flamingos. So it was like the two sisters were able to put half remembered memories together and, you know, find something out of that. So yes.
So this is, of course, a loaded question to ask you while you're sitting in Lahore, but it is an extension, I suppose, of the question of whether family ties mean anything. But does a stranger mean something particular just because you have this family relationship? Does Pakistan mean anything to you?
It means a great deal to me, actually. What does it mean?
What is your relationship to this country?
Well, I'm the only person and my three siblings that have visited Pakistan, and this is the third time I've been here. I came as a schoolgirl, and then I came in 2006 with a filmmaker friend to do research for the novel. I think it stems through personal and familial relationships, and it stems possibly from that initial visit, and I think there is something about the warmth and the openness and the beauty of the country that is very affecting to me, and definitely made a lasting impression on me as a young woman. And as a writer, I think sometimes I've been thinking about the question of the nature of home and how writers and artists are inspired by the home, the roots that they come from, and the way in which nostalgia, which literally means leaving home and pain, there's a kind of creative inspiration about coming to a country like this and meeting the people and connecting it with my own past. And of course, politically and in other ways, it's become such an important place. And another thing that happened to me on that visit when I came when I was 19 was we were staying with some friends of my father in Peshawar, and the person that we were staying with, I believe, was the chief medical officer in the army. Don't quote me on that, and I think he's passed away now, but he was very senior in the army, and he asked me what I'd like to do, and I said I'd like to go up the Khyber Pass, which in 1985, or thereabouts, was still a little bit possible. So we drove along, and there was an army escort and all the rest of it. And then later he said to me, everything that happens in this part of the world, the northwest frontier province, affects the history of the world. And in 1985, that made no impact upon me. It was only after 9/11 that I thought to myself, okay, now I understand a little bit more And what would my father have felt if he'd lived to see this? What do his friends think? What's that about? So in a way, the book isn't a 9/11 story, but something about that conversation that I'd had stayed with me and came back to me years later.
Maybe it's not a fair question to ask, but do you have any idea why you've come back and your siblings haven't? Why is it because you're a writer?
It's an interesting question, actually. To be fair, my sister would have come this week, and she couldn't. But I think it has to do with the kind of family that we had, and the fact that my parents tended to it was we separated out our English lives from our Pakistani lives, and for some reason, you know how it is in families, siblings have very different attitudes and relationships to their parents within one family, and I think there was something about my father that always made me interested in that culture, and I had a different kind of relationship to him and his world than my brother or sister. My brother, in the meantime, has distanced himself a lot from my father and changed his name and found that very difficult to deal with.
Right. Would you read the second page?
Okay. This is the point in the story at which Harris is going to meet a woman who's been introduced to him by his friends in the hall. Harris headed down to Greenwich to meet a potential bride for himself, something he had put off until now. Her phone number and address had lodged in his diary for months, and on his last visit to Lahore, Omar and his wife had pressed him to get in touch with her. Now that he was alone in the world, they said, why not? Harris had been fearful of embarking upon something new at first, taking the plunge in unfathomable waters. So as he drove through London, he told himself he was just going to look her up, out of courtesy, and take things from there. According to the map, her postcode was SE10, a somewhat unsavoury area, or so he'd heard. The Friday afternoon traffic towards the Blackwall Tunnel crawled to a standstill, and he consulted the A to Z to locate the quickest route. Dr. Farah was a widow with an impressive CV, and Harris was nervous that his own accomplishments might pale in comparison. Apparently she had a PhD in something related to English literature. Shakespearean tragedy, wasn't it? That was all he could recall. Her husband, Idris, had died a couple of years before, not long after he left his job at a medical equipment company, where he had enjoyed a moderately successful career. A weather-beaten flower seller appeared before Harris's windscreen, brandishing sprays of cheap carnations in improbable shades of neon lemon and ultraviolet blue. For a moment he was tempted to buy a bunch, then worried they were tasteless. The worry transmuted into low-level anxiety when he realized he would arrive, empty-handed, at her house. So he stopped at a newsagent's close by and armed himself with a box of After 8 mint chocolates. A classic choice, he felt. She was a youthful 50, he guessed, observing her at a distance through the living room windows of her house. Her hair was divided into 2 heavy black curtains, though her parting betrayed a band of bright silver. Around her neck she wore spectacles dangling on a gold chain that appeared to bother her. She kept pulling them on and off her nose as she moved about her living room. He tried to pluck up the courage to approach the front door and rap its intimidating brass knocker. Personally, he'd always favoured an electric doorbell, a simple ding-dong that resonated pleasantly through the house, yet he could see now a door knocker was far superior. He was already beginning to fret about this and other shortcomings of his house when she disappeared from view. He lost his nerve and nipped back up the road until he was safely out of sight, then dialed her number on his mobile.
Well, we spoke about your relationship to Pakistan, but I'm also interested in your relationship to London, and particular Whitechapel, which is... Did you grow up near Whitechapel?
I didn't. No, I moved there in 1995, just after I got married.
Right. But I know you write some, or you have written some pieces for the blog Spitalfield Live.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's clearly a part of town that you have great affection for. And could you talk a little about Whitechapel and why that's your bit in London?
Okay. It was a slightly random choice as it is when you're looking for a house, but that's where I ended up living in 1995. And Whitechapel's a very rich and interesting part of London. It's, as I say somewhere in the book, it's the second cheapest property on the Monopoly board. Not anymore.
What's the cheapest?
We don't. Way out now. And so I was living there in that area, and it's very close to an area called Spitalfields, which historically has been a very important place for immigrants from all over the world, but particularly a lot of Jewish immigrants came there in the 19th century, and then in the 50s and 60s and 70s, Bangladeshis and Indians and Pakistanis arrived, and there was quite a blend between those two worlds, the Jewish world and the Islamic world there. And of course, it's a very poor area, so many people became prosperous and moved out to the suburbs. So I found it a very inspiring place to live, and we lived in a house which had a large room at the top, which was where weavers would sit and work, because Huguenots were, of course, big, part of that big immigration wave who came to the East End of London. So I am interested in location and geography and a sense of place, and I really wanted to have that sense of East London in the story, even though it wasn't where I'd grown up. I'd grown up outside of London. And I think that that inspired me quite a lot. There was a very large mosque nearby, and some of the restaurants feature in my story. And there are a lot of restaurants in that area called Lahore 1, 2, 3, 4, and variations on that theme. And so there was a lot going. There was a lot of material which I gleaned as a writer and wove into the story.
Because here I think we like to feed on tales of how our kind are badly treated elsewhere, and as a consequence, I think a lot of stories come through, sort of particularly post the 7/7 bombings, of
yes.
Sort of suspicion that Pakistanis live under. But you've had the experience. Your father was a migrant to the UK. You grew up there, and you were living in America for a while, but now moved back with your family. So I suppose this means your kids will be third-generation Londoners, or third-generation Brits.
Yeah.
And what are your feelings on actually the difference from generation to generation of how the UK responds to its migrants, or what it is to be someone who's not totally Anglo living in the UK?
I think it's really evolved enormously when I listen to stories that my father would tell me about, driving around in Sheffield in the 60s and being stopped by an angry policeman, literally shaken by his coat and sort of shouted at. Do you speak English? This particular policeman said to my dad. I think the police will have a hard time getting away with that now, but so the world has changed immeasurably since that time. So I think it's a very big part of the conversation, what it means to be an immigrant in Europe, in Britain, and what it means to be a Muslim. And it is part of the conversation in a way that it certainly wasn't when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. So your question of what it means to be an Anglo, it seems like it's very, after living in New York, which is a much more segregated kind of town, London feels very blended, and the schools are very mixed. There are little ghettos still in London, but it feels like it's very much, it's just very normal and very natural, I think.
What are your feelings on labels as a writer? So sort of migrant writer, British writer, American writer, diaspora writer. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I think I'm not allergic to it. I know some writers really hate it. I know that writers like Monica Ali have spoken out a little bit about that and been afraid of being labelled as an Asian writer or any of those things that you've mentioned. I don't feel strongly about it. I think it's a marketing issue for publishers. They're often looking for a way in which you can hang a book on something that people can relate to. So I can understand why you might do that. And you can get pigeonholed, but in the end, it's about if you're identified in a particular way, there's usually a reason for it. I do like to write other things and explore other worlds.
Of course, the other pigeonholing is the form. So we can talk as a novelist, but you've also written scripts. And is it? Do you want to continue working between the two forms? Is there a way in which writing scripts brought something to the table for you as a novelist that was particularly helpful?
I think there was, but I was a frustrated script writer really, and I had enormous problems getting a lot of people do, getting a script seen through to production. And I had actually written a screenplay called Taxi to Mecca, which featured quite a few of these characters who showed up later in the novel. So I had thought through quite a lot of them, and in the end, one of the reasons for writing the novel was thinking, if I write a novel, maybe I'll get to make a film. Maybe I'll finally get a screenplay commissioned and followed through. So I would very much like to return to this and to do both. And I've written a play that just had a reading at a theatre at a festival in London about a very different subject. And I'm also exploring radio drama now.
Would you be interested in turning the novel into a script?
I would, and actually there was a production company that got in touch with me before Christmas, and they were interested in it. I think it could make an interesting TV drama. I'm not sure about a film. It has a lot of characters, but yeah, that would be great.
The inevitable final question before we open up is, what next?
Well, I'm working on a range of different things. As I said, I'm doing a radio play. I'm making a radio documentary about the importance of roots and home on writers and artists. I'm writing short stories, and I'm hoping to get going by next novel.
So nothing much. We'll open up to questions. There should be a mic coming around, so if you could raise your hand, and we'll get the people with the mics to come in. In the second row, I think the mic first. Gentleman in the second row.
New generation onwards, do you see more assimilation of Pakistani background people into that society, so that the present stories that are being written and the present characters, do you think they'll become irrelevant in the coming 15 to 20 years' time?
No, I don't see why they should become irrelevant. I think that there's a long history, and it's about blending the past and the present. And I think there are very interesting hybrids that are going to be thrown up in the coming decade or 20 years.
Hi, Rosie. It's so nice to see you here. Do you find sometimes you have to struggle and defend the Pakistan that you know, as opposed to being objective and presenting a story? Because I've lived in the U.S. for a long time, and I felt that there were times that I was compelled to defend almost a picture that people had made in their mind, and I knew different. And now that I'm living in Pakistan, I sometimes find myself defending America because people have such presumptions of people and lifestyles. So I find that struggle very interesting, and I find that sometimes it can color how you write something. Do you go through that sometimes as a writer?
I do, very much. I mean, having lived in, I think growing up in Britain at the time that I did, you were made to feel very defensive about coming from a Pakistani background, and it was regarded askance in some ways. And then living in the United States for 7 years in New York, which of course is, cosmopolitan centre, I did find myself at times, even around the most educated, sophisticated people, have annoyingly uninformed or ill-informed presumptions about Pakistan and that part of the world. And I would never hold myself up as any expert about it. I'm simply not. But it was a little frustrating, and in some ways, it's one of the reasons where I felt like I wanted to be back in Britain, because I feel like there's a deeper connection between Britain and South Asia. I'm not sure if that's true. And again, I have a similar experience to you. Now I'm back in England, people have very parochial views about what it means to be American, and Americans are this and Americans are that, and you're automatically in the defensive. And I think it's just one of the side effects of being a person who's lived in different places, and you get those different perspectives, and it makes you uncomfortable, and it's unsettling. But I think that's also quite creative. I've certainly found that coming back to Britain, although it's been a big upheaval for me, it's made me think of lots of new stories and ideas, and in some ways New York was too comfortable a place.
Well, yeah. When you were growing up and your parents were first generation immigrants, were there like a lot of stories you grew up with that this was how my village was like, my aunts, my uncles? So was that kind of the backdrop, and what was the effect, and was it always like like the first generation never really quite settles into that country? And could you just say a little about that?
Yes. I think there is that issue. I mean, it was certainly for my father, there were a lot of stories, and my mother, who's English, who is still alive, she spent 2 or 3 years living in this country. She ran away from her home in England to marry my father, and so she does like to talk about things that happened at that time, and he talked about his mother and his father and their background. So that sort of almost folkloric village story certainly entered my consciousness from quite an early stage, and it certainly caught my imagination. And I think, to answer your second point, there is a sense in which that generation never fully can let go of home and the past and fully embrace the new world, whatever that world is, whether it's England or whether it's America. And that Jhumpa Lahiri writes very well about that. I think she writes in quite a very narrow section of the community, but she captures that rather brilliantly, I think.
Hi. I just need to ask, personally, I feel very strongly about divisions and labeling, and I feel labels create those divisions. Whenever I try to tell that story, I'm not a writer, but I do work in advertising, and I want to tell a story. There's a sense of melancholy or loss that comes for me. I feel from, and I haven't read your book, I'm going to pick it up, but I feel from whatever the excerpts that you read, there's a sense of positivity, as if you're trying to blur those lines or looking at it with a slightly more, positive feel. So how do you get that? How do you not feel the sense of loss when you're talking about divisions and labels?
I think it's a fusion, it's a blend. I think there's a sort of blend of melancholy and comedy. That's certainly that's definitely something that I respond to as a writer when I read other books and other stories. And if you can kind of capture that, otherwise I think things become a little bit gloomy. And I also think, I don't think as a writer you can make that slightly manufactured decision to present positive images of a particular group or a particular culture. I don't think it ever works when you do that. I don't know what you think about that.
Agreed. Any other questions? We've got 5 questions from row 2 here. So row 2 is really leaving. And if I were row 4 or 7, I'd start feeling a bit competitive about why all the questions are coming from there. Oh, there's one from up there, gentlemen, requiring them. If you could raise your hand against the man with the mic, could come and find you.
Hi Rosie, how are you? I'm Adnan Sattar, I'm a student of literature. So I would like to know about imperialism. First, imperialism was being done by the Westerns physically, but now it's being done mentally. So I would like to know the reasons why is it so that Americans show or whatever Westerns show themselves to be perfect mentally more than the Eastern people. So yesterday I listened a talk about, there was a woman who's Amrita Shedil. she painted nude women. The thing is that they were telling us that we are lost generations. So I have come to know that lost generation is the same generation. It's all over the world. After world wars, we find that lost generation is there. So what is the solution? I'm in a complexity whether the lost generation is depicted by Hemingway or by Allama Iqbal in his poetry, that who is reforming lost generation, the Easterns or the Westerns, or both as well. So mostly the superiority is given to the Westerns in this regard. What do you say about this?
It's a great and complicated question. I think it's all about who has. There's a question of power and control, and I think one of the issues that came up in a discussion I had on Monday was Urdu writers versus, South Asian writers writing in English, and that English writers have a hegemony, and that gives them a kind of access to the publishing world and to getting their work out there that Urdu writers don't necessarily have. Or so I think it's very difficult to get over that question of language and what's going to happen in the future. I think with the problem of distributing Urdu writers and people not speaking that, and the current generation choosing, say, Pakistani writers writing in English, it's always going to kind of give a different perspective that privileges the West, probably. I don't know what you think.
It's a large question. No, it's true.
No
There
other
is,
question?
I mean, it's about cultural imperialism. That whoever, but I don't think it's true to say that previously imperialism was physical, now it's mental. The British Raj was entirely a mental colonization to an extent that far exceeds anything going on now. You wouldn't have had this kind of conversation at the height of the British Raj. It wouldn't have been legal. So, there's that.
Rosie, here is a question if you allow. Here she is.
Hello. So this half brother that you talked about, and sending him books and everything. So now that you're here, would you want to visit his family? Would you want any ties with them? Does it hold any importance to you, or that was just something that just an exchange of letters, sent him books, and that was it? Or would you want to go and meet them?
I think if I got longer, I would like to explore the country and go back to some of those places and see some of those old relatives and so on that I met a long time ago. Definitely, I'm leaving tonight though, so I'm on a short visit this time. But yes, I think there's something to be had from that, from all sides. Yeah.
Hello. It's very nice here, regarding the gentleman's question, what came to my mind was Wretched of Heart by Franz Fanon. Yes, colonization and imperialism has always been more of a psychological and mental process that always begins in history. What I find very interesting in your readings is the positivity that you are generating. And that is also working psychologically. And it's great that, the purpose of LLF is being accomplished here, that positivity is generated. So thank you very much for bringing that positive thoughts in our life when we really need them. Now, my question here is regarding language. Yes, you are being lucky that you have your, I call it being lucky because you are experiencing different cultures. Your father is from Pakistan and your mother is from Britain, so that's all. So why don't you bring that thing in your language? Why don't you just bring some certain phrases from Pakistani culture, some Pakistani terminology, and then that terminology? Wouldn't that be a good process to begin with?
Yes, I agree. It's a struggle with the publisher. There are quite a few. The book is peppered with some phrases, and I'm embarrassed I'm not an Urdu or Punjabi speaker, and a family when I grew up, that was, my father made the choice not to speak that language, so I lack that. But there are some phrases, and they have remained. And there was a little bit of a struggle, especially with the American publisher, who, they wanted to include a glossary and things like that. So, it's a blend, really, of trying to make it intelligible and to give it a kind of flavour. But I agree, it's a good idea. Thank you.
Ma'am, I have a question. This asks for your personal opinion apart from all the discourse that we have of diaspora, and how is it that we term writers as belonging to a certain part of the country, the world. Obviously, the writer's own, words and thoughts about this matters, but as for you, a writer, say, who has, belonged to Pakistan in the early years of his or her life, has been born here, lived for 7 years, and has gone abroad and is writing from there. Would you consider them, and this is to both of you, would you consider them Pakistani writers? Because a Pakistani writer's term itself is, a little bit complex, because a lot of writers are living from, various parts of the world.
Yeah.
So, would you term them as Pakistanis? Into what would be the grounds of that logic?
I think it's a really, really interesting question. I was actually having a little chat with Kamila's mum about that last night, about the notion of if you're, with Hanif Qureshi, he's half Pakistani, half British, but I think born in England. But what category does he fall into? And some people have, in the critical establishment, have a very strong view of that. And I think it can be hampering and hindering to get too hung up and judgmental and essentialist about whether he or she is a Pakistani writer or a British writer. I think you write from your heart and your soul and your sense of creativity, and if that person has lived in and was born in a particular place, then perhaps that is the correct label. And I think it's also tough for writers who perhaps they've been born here, but they don't want to necessarily be labelled as just Pakistani writers, but just writers. Otherwise, you do then fall into that essentialist trap.
I cannot imagine anyone in Ireland saying that James Joyce is not an Irish writer because he wrote from Paris. Right.
That's a really good example.
James Joyce is the quintessential, and Ireland celebrates him, and the fact that he was in Paris is considered completely irrelevant, because what matters is, if you read James Joyce, you don't think this was written by a man sitting in Paris. And maybe that's sort of crucial, is the work itself, rather than the biography of how many years you were here and how many years, but what is coming after the work, I suspect, would be the answer. But I mean, it is a difficult one. I think it's one thing, because with James Joyce, of course, Joyce grew up in Ireland, he knew Ireland. If you come to writers who have a Pakistani parent, but actually have never ever lived in Pakistan, that's a different category. I know it's a different category, but it makes it a more complicated question.
Different emphasis. I think the Joyce example is a really excellent one, because in a way he's highly influenced, wasn't he, by Irish culture and again political struggle. So it's a good comparison with South Asia and Pakistan and writing from the diaspora, yet highly informed by the culture and politics.
But I do think we should make the definitions as broad rather than as narrow as possible. I was in Australia a few years ago, and I was told, anyone who's, so J.M. Coetzee, South African writer, he's been living in Australia for a few years, and I'm told, Australians count him as an Australian writer, because why wouldn't you want to consider J.M. Coetzee one of your own? And you think, okay, fair enough. So I think make it broad.
Yes.
Other questions? There's one lady right at the back raising her hand up at the top. Where have we lost the mic?
Right in the back row.
Right in the back row. If you could raise your hand again so that the mics can find you. And I think you're going to be the last question, so there's a weight on you.
I wonder if I could start with a comment, because as a cross-cultural linguist looking at language and language systems and identity and the nexus between religion, culture and language, which lies at the base of this whole area of study, especially cross-cultural. I'd just like to make a comment that perhaps identity is much more of a chosen thing in our era than it was in the past. And that is very much an aspect of all, I think, artists' struggle. And it is no longer, I think, necessary to, as Rosie and Kamila, you've been kind of talking around this issue. It's much, much more a question of people becoming part of a post-global culture where they have strands that they may identify with. So it's like a tapestry of, I've lived in Australia, I have an Australian mother and a father from East Punjab, and I grew up in Pakistan the first 16 years. So I do speak fluent Urdu and Punjabi and write it as well. And ended up teaching people from 140 countries over 20 years in Australia. So I think that when people came to Australia, whether they came from Sierra Leone or whether they came from Russia or Pakistan, the thing was that they had to start looking at how they could identify with the landscape so that it wasn't so alien for so long. I think the landscape of your childhood is very deeply embedded in your psyche with associations, and as well as the sounds. So I remember for the first decade, I was 16 when I went to live there permanently, finishing my schooling and then going on to university and being an eternal student. What I discovered was that
I'm here to bring
yeah,
up,
I just want to bring the question.
question
Yes, and the question is this: were there any sounds, images, and apart from stories and personal recollections, that were part of the nostalgia that you visit again and again, or have you outgrown it completely through all your writings, and now you have this very integrated voice that combines comedy and irony and all those other magnificent features that qualify your writing?
I think I continue to be very influenced by the weather, and I'm slightly obsessed with it.
You are a Brit.
I am a Brit, but I think the copy editor, the sub-editor, when she first went through my book, made this comment saying, "Come on, it's windy and rainy again. It's June," and I thought, well, that's what Britain is like. I can have a very powerful, deep-seated memory of what it felt like to be in England and to be cold and to be wet, and I think that's something that I kind of identified with my father and with immigrants and their experience of coming to Britain, so that has stayed with me.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you, Rosie. And please go and buy Rosie's book, and she'll be signing it in Hall 2.